Hey everyone. This is my fourth NACIS, but my first time presenting. And this project was really special because it really is a project sort of NACIS. My master's thesis, I had interviewed 17 cartographers who worked in the news industry, many of whom are NACIS members, and some of whom may even be among us now. And so the background behind this research really came from the fact that some of the most broadly impactful, important, and innovative maps that we're seeing now are happening in the news and are being made by cartographers who work at news organizations. I think this means cartographers should be asking the same sort of ethical questions of their maps that a journalist may ask of their stories. And that's because, of course, as we all know, maps can still get the facts wrong. They can still invade privacy. They can still propagate harmful narratives and in the name of balancing both sides of an issue. So as a result of my interview study, I found a lot of agreement among many news cartographers about what we ought to be doing, and so I'm happy to present for you now 7 rules for more ethical news maps sourced from the people who make them. So, of course, just a little background on journalism ethics. Journalism ethics are broadly concerned with truth-telling, accuracy, fairness, minimizing harm, accountability, transparency, and serving a democratic republic. These ethics have been codified by many organizations, including the Society of Professional Journalists, whose code of ethics framework I used for my research questions. This is a little preview of those. I'm not going to go through them all, of course. I transcribed all my interviews and ended up coding over 1,000 individualized statements. All of that is to say, rest assured, if I say most people agreed on something, know that I do have the numbers to back that up. So just a quick picture at my interview sample. Everyone I talked to had a bachelor's degree, some of whom had master's degrees. There was a pretty broad sample in terms of fields of study and experience. I really wanted to get a mixture of folks who worked both in international and national news and in smaller or regional news organizations. Okay, now we'll get into what it means to be an ethical news cartographer. These results touch on many steps in the map-making process, including, of course, collecting and analyzing data, designing your map, as well as conduct post-publication. And I just want to say I think these tips are applicable to anyone who makes maps, not just those who do so in a news context. So the first rule, you should interview your data. What does that mean? Well, in news cartography, right, and in news generally, and largely in cartography, most of the data that we're representing tends to be compiled or created by someone else. We don't often have the insight into what went into creating that data, and so a lot of the folks I spoke with talked about the importance of questioning and verifying the data you're working with in order to derive truth from it. I love this quote. This participant said, we need to evaluate data because data is only as good as what goes into it and the people who keep it. And so interviewing your data, again, might be asking questions of it similar to what a reporter might be asking a source they're interviewing. Who put this together? How was it compiled? Maybe this leads you to interview the person who created the data to understand a little bit more about the methodology behind it, right? Does it match up with similar data sets? Can you reproduce its conclusion? Are there any anomalies or spikes that would lead you to question the veracity of it? I have an example from my time working at the Wall Street Journal. Here's a map that my colleague Carl Churchill put together. Very common map you see in news. This was of the heat maps, the heat wave that was happening this summer throughout the country. I was often checking Carl's maps. And he'd have me essentially retrieve the same data, but from a different portal, and then do sort of spot checks, checking different points to see if the temperatures lined up. And this, of course, had the dual benefit of testing the veracity of the data from different portals, as well as checking and see if he styled it correctly, right? If his color buckets corresponded with the data set. There's a tension here, of course, because working in the news, we often do not have a ton of time to do all the verification of our data that we'd like to do, or that maybe would be best to do, which leads well into the second rule, is that sometimes we have to embrace the uncertainty, right? Often in news cartography, we are dealing with situations that are rapidly unfolding, situations that are happening in faraway places that we might not be able to validate on the ground or check with corroborating data sets. And so it's really important to think about how we're representing the stuff that we do know and the stuff that we don't know. And so a lot of the participants I spoke with talked about fuzzy design techniques, right, in order to sort of represent that uncertainty, because things like solid lines, precise points tend to lend a lot of authority. So some examples of that, dashed lines on your strokes, in this case to indicate Ukrainian advances, showing the general movement of troops, but not necessarily the exact movements on the ground. I also think this is really important when you are representing contested territory, where there's different interests vying for the same territory. So of course the example that's much talked about, of course, Crimea, the Donbass. This example uses a hatched pattern, something that doesn't lend legitimacy to the claim of Russia in this case, but does indicate the situation on the ground. And of course, this map's a little small, but dashed symbols here instead of solid symbols to indicate the various territorial claims in the Kashmir region. Rule number 3 is that you need to be thinking about multiple perspectives and recognize that you probably can't represent them all on the same map. Right, you need to sort of embrace the multiplicity and probably do more than one map if you're trying to tell a nuanced story. News maps, by their very nature, are supposed to really only show one thing or communicate a single message, and that is tricky when telling a balanced story. So a lot of my participants talked about doing multiple maps in your stories. Here's a really good example from the Washington Post on a story on coal mines. There was one map in the story that showed, the economics, right? Here's how many jobs this mine employs. Here's how many tons of coal it produces. And then later in the story, we get into more maps that show the environmental impact of these mines and the way it degrades the landscape. These are things that would be impossible to show on the same map. You shouldn't try to do that. But you also shouldn't tell a story that doesn't include both of these visuals. Multiple perspectives also are at play when you're thinking about place names, right? There's sometimes multiple place names. You can get into thorny issues with geopolitics. This body of water has a different name depending on who you ask. So you have to be aware of that. And also thinking about things like when is it appropriate to use indigenous place names and what stories might call for that to present a more balanced perspective on the landscape and tell a more balanced story. Rule number 4 is that context is key. There's an old line that every map of a given city is the same, and this kind of points to how many sort of things that we might seek to map, be it health indicators, wealth, crime, they tend to line up in the same sorts of ways with racial and economic populations. And there's historic context to why that is, and that history is really important, and you have to be thinking about how your maps can convey that to your readers. No map exists in a vacuum. I mean, it's been written about many times how maps tend to correspond with things like redlining. And so you should be thinking about sort of the present day legacies of redlining and how to communicate that to your readers. This is one of my favorite quotes in the sample. One of my participants talked about, many of these maps are just going to reinforce conventional wisdom anyway. Why would you do that? Why would you make a map that just tells people what they already know or reinforces what they already might think? That's not really good journalism. So think about how your maps can do this. This is something we really try to do at the Star Tribune. Instead of mapping, for example, poverty, we mapped zoning rules that keep the metro area segregated. Instead of mapping, say, obesity or some other sort of health indicator, we mapped urban tree canopy and linked that to disparities in health. So thinking about how can you map the context around these stories. And also think about the context when you're deciding what to make maps of, and think about the narratives that might exist in your community. Again, no map exists in a vacuum, so consider how your map fits into the world. Again, at the Star Tribune, we stopped doing locator maps for crimes because we felt that they were sort of fitting into these narratives that had been already existing around crime in our community, and decided, these are potentially harmful to keep doing these and just really not worth the time and resources. Rule number 5, make an imaginary friend. This participant, I love this quote so much, said, when they're working on a map, they imagine a reader is standing on their shoulder the entire time, watching what they're doing, and thinking about, if they see the final product, would they feel wronged? Would they feel as though something were hidden from them? I think it's a really good thing to sort of cultivate this mindset and think about how we can be more accountable, more transparent to our audience. There's a lot of really cool innovation happening in this space right now. This is an example from Harry Stevens' column at the Washington Post. Harry makes all of the data behind his maps accessible with links to them, and even issues a very explicit call to check his work. Harry is, of course, a columnist, and there's different standards for columnists, but I think this is something that we can all learn from in terms of turning our process inside out and making it open to inspection, because as this participant pointed out, there's no way we're going to get it right every single time. And I think by making our work sort of available like this, it shows we're acting in good faith, and I think builds accountability, builds trust in the maps. That's something that Tim's going to talk about after me. Rule 5, sub-rule A, is that you should also make real friends. And what I mean by that is your job does not end after you hit publish, right? You should be aware of how your maps are existing out in the world. So here's an example. This is a map I made this summer at the Wall Street Journal after the terrible wildfire in Maui. And I made this map derived from some satellite imagery that identified which buildings burned down in that fire. I think we were one of the first publications to do this, and it made the rounds on Twitter, and it actually went kind of viral on the Maui subreddit, where people were actually using it to find out, if their house or business burned down, and questioning sort of where this information came from. So I saw this and jumped into the chat and just sort of introduced myself, put a face behind the map, and talked about sort of how I got this information, right? I looked at these satellite images, I compared it to previous, before the fire, I had NDVI data as well to help cross-check it. And again, I think this is an example of building trust and accountability post-publication as well. Rule number 6. We may come into contact with data that is individually identifiable, puts a point on somebody's house. Think about important issues. Opioid overdoses, EMS data, right? Or gun licenses, right? You could map this data, and it's going to put a point on somebody's house. Most of the participants I spoke with talked about how you shouldn't do this, or you should aggregate it in some way to mask the individuals in the data, because the clarity from that information is going to be so outweighed by the cost to that person. And here's an example, again, from the Star Tribune, where we did this with EMS data on opioid overdoses. This sort of had a virtuous effect or virtuous cycle, rather, where not only were we reducing harm in doing this, but also this is a much more readable map, right? You can clearly see the trends and the hotspots in the data. But I'm also going to complicate the idea of aggregating a little bit, because as we know, aggregating data is abstracting it. It is removing the humanity from the data, and there are times when maybe that's not called for. This was a sort of viral tweet thread that went around during the initial invasion of Ukraine, showing how many maps showed refugee flows and troop movements in Ukraine looked really similar, used these same sort of stylistic flow arrows, even though these are representing incredibly different things. And so that leads to rule number 7, which is to be a human, right? It's very easy to forget that data often represent people, right? Many of us just went through mapping the COVID pandemic, and daily we were dealing with data points that represent humans' lives. And I think it's really important when possible to try to evoke that humanity in our maps. And I think some of the most memorable news maps I've seen do that really well. This is a really great example from the New York Times of a map of a COVID outbreak in a very dense neighborhood in Queens. And I think it does a really good job creating a mood and establishing sort of the gravity of the situation for the people in this neighborhood. A similar example, much talked about from the Washington Post, that visualized these COVID deaths as beams of light ascending into the sky. I think there's something really important here, right? There's an overall truth that you're getting at with this map that you can only get to when you make that emotional connection with the audience, that you can't get them to appreciate when the data is highly abstract. And I think this is something we ought to be thinking about more as cartographers and doing when we can. So there was a lot of discussion in this sample. There are many more rules, if you like, and a lot of disagreement too. I will share my thesis in the chat after this for review, and I'm happy to talk about other sort of best practices. Where there is agreement, though, I think there is room for sort of codifying these ethics and potentially putting out a document or something that news cartographers can sort of point to when they're navigating some of these decisions. So with that, I would love some questions. Thanks.
I'm just curious from your sample set of organizations that you talked with, if you incorporated most new media or media of languages other than English speakers, any independent journalists, and how you think that might affect
Yeah, I can talk more. The question was sort of about like selection criteria for my interview sample. So I kind of set out with sort of two sampling criteria that were really important to me to make sure the sample was diverse in the opinions I was getting. I wanted at least half of participants to come from news organizations that were sort of national, international, and then have to at least come from news organizations that were more local and regional. And as you saw from the earlier slide, I actually exceeded both by a significant margin, and I think that's because people in this industry tend to move around a lot, so folks often had experience at both sorts of scales. I did reach out to a number of independent journalists. There aren't a large number of independent journalists working in this space or working at because a lot of these projects are very multidisciplinary, bring together a lot of different skills, people with traditional journalistic experience, coders, designers, things like that. And you asked about student media as well. I did not reach out to any student media, just again because I think a lot of this is very technical work. I haven't at least seen a lot of work from student media that does this. And then I also sought to ensure that at least half of my sample had studied something in undergrad or grad school that wasn't journalism. And so I pulled in a number of participants who had degrees in things like arts, graphic design, public policy, history, and of course geography and things like that as well. And I think they brought really interesting perspectives to the interview sample. Yes?
Did you hear from folks who spoke to the experience of when they're getting assigned a map
Mm-hmm.
and how they push back if it doesn't feel like it aligns with their values or goes
Mm-hmm.
against their code of ethics?
Yeah, I did. I'm trying to summon a good example. I mean, a lot of the crime maps were sort of a recurrent topic. I think a number of people felt uncomfortable sort of putting a spot on a map around a crime. Yeah, I think there are examples of that.
Was it received well?
I think it varies. I think newsroom tend to have, at least from my experience, right, there are some newsrooms that are doing a lot better at sort of giving graphics reporters sort of the autonomy to make those sort of storytelling decisions. There are some that are still viewing graphics journalists more as sort of a supplement to the reporting versus like reporters themselves with their own sort of storytelling agency. And so I think, you know, your mileage will vary depending on where you work. Yeah.
Yes. So from your personal opinion, when you did the interviews, do you feel like the journalists are making better, like more ethic maps over time, or like it's just like this?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, sorry. The question was based on my interviews if I felt that if I got the impression that journalists are making better ethical decisions, better maps over time. We're certainly thinking about it. I think there's a lot of thinking about it. A lot of the responses I got were like, you know, I'm glad you're asking me these questions. I think about this all the time, but we don't often, you know, take this time to stop and reflect on like how we're doing, what we could be doing differently. So I think it definitely revealed a sense that like everyone who does this should just take some time to, and with maybe individually and with their teams, to reflect on sort of practices, long-standing practices, evaluate what's working and what's not, and maybe what needs to change. And that is an example of that, right? Again, going back to the crime maps that resulted from one of those conversations at the Star Tribune.
All right.
Thank you.